today for the Environmental and Green AI event. We are ecstatic to bring a very important and relevant topic to your attention with our distinguished guests. We will be recording this event, so if you'd like to check it out later, it will be available later for you on our YouTube channel. First, I'd like to introduce ourselves shortly, our mission and vision, and of course, how you can be a part of our community. We are Women in AI and Robotics Germany, the first non-profit association in Germany dedicated to the advancement of women in the field of artificial intelligence and robotics. Our mission is to empower, educate, and support the next generation of female AI and robotics enthusiasts. We aim to increase the representation of these enthusiasts in these fields. Sorry, I'm having some trouble. Yeah, now it is coming. Yeah, our aim is to increase the representation of women in AI and robotics, which we believe that would make the world a more just, ethical, and responsible place. And our goal is to establish national and international collaborations to create opportunities for women to network with role models around the world. If you would like to reach us, you can reach us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. I will shortly be sharing a link tree with you that you can reach all of our social accounts from this link. Without further ado, I'd like to give the platform to our beloved member and our host today, Dr. Maria Berner.
Really, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Lucas. So as Madam already mentioned, you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. So I was still a little bit busy with letting people in. So how are we planning this event today? So first of all, I will introduce myself and Madam a little bit, and then we will directly go into the introduction of our speakers, our experts in the field of green AI, and they will present a little bit what they are working on, the project they are working on, and then we'll directly go into a little panel discussion, asking some questions. So please also send your question to us in the chat, and we will pose this question to the experts and to the speakers. So my name is Maria Berner. I'm one of the core team members here in Women in AI and Robotics, as well as Melton. We are both from the Berlin team. And now I would like to present you the speakers. So first of all, we have Wiebke. Wiebke is a PhD student at the Hasso Plattner Institute, and she's working on digital sustainability. Her research is focused on topics like what kind of carbon footprint different components and projects have and how you can optimize them. We also have Xinchi. She's a PhD student at Cambridge University, and she's measuring the carbon footprint of AI projects. So, and she's also checking the AI carbon footprint of centralized AI project, as well as for federated learning projects. Another expert is Lucas Spreiter. He's founder of Untitled, the sustainable AI agency, and he will also show us on which kind of project he's working on and how does it correlate to green AI. So first of all, Wiebke will show us her project she's working on, or her research, and then we will continue with Lucas and then Xinchi. So I will try to follow and change the slides. If I'm not in time, just tell me to change the slides that everyone can see and follow visually what the people are talking about. So Wiebke, please.
Thank you. So I come from a business administration background, and what I've looked into in my research is how digital technologies in general, and as part of that AI, can be leveraged for sustainable development, and how companies can create new business models using digital technologies that will help us achieve sustainable development. And now what I've found is that there are 4 different perspectives we should take when trying to assess whether we are actually promoting sustainable development. And the first 2 are centered on the technologies that we're actually using. So that will be sustainable design of digital technologies. Essentially, this means that we need process transparency, that we need to extend product life cycles, and that sustainable design needs to be a prerogative when we are creating technologies. And then on the other hand, we have sustainable digitalization, and that is more concerned with the adherence of to agreed upon sustainability standards. So this is more of an eco-efficiency perspective, that we essentially that we need to try and reduce the resources being consumed through digitalization. Now, these 2 are prerogatives for the third perspective, which is sustainability through digitalization. And in this perspective, we are using digital technologies, digitalization, as a means to achieve sustainability or sustainable development as an end. And this is all centered around which purposes we are trying to fulfill with these technologies. And the question really is, what is the purpose of your system, and how are you enabling sustainable development through your business model, which is employing digital technologies and is being made possible through digital technologies. And then the fourth perspective, and this is a bit more philosophical, is offsetting. And this is all about recognizing that all technologies have negative impacts. And thus, by recognizing that, we can try and achieve a state where the benefits and the positive impacts we are creating outweigh the harm that these technologies do cause. So it's a bit of an utopian view, and it could be argued that actually assessing whether it is achieved would be hard, but that's more of a mindset perspective, really. And then Maria, if you would move on to the next slide. Then I also looked at how companies, or what companies actually can do with regard to the third perspective, which is sustainability through digitalization. And now my perspective, didn't only include environmental aspects, but also social ones. But I did identify 11 activity groups, I call them. And the first 2, you can see they're more human-centered and behavior-centered, about providing access to participation, information, knowledge, education. Those would be more social. Then, raising awareness and influencing behaviors is all about nudging, gamification, essentially making the better choices, the better behavior desirable. The third group is around making sustainability accessible and supporting decision making. And I think this is where AI, would perform best. This is all about enabling data-driven decisions and helping us actually measure the impacts that we're having. And the fourth group, again, is about eco-efficiency and optimizing resource consumption. And the fifth group, creating new economic systems. This would be about decoupling of growth and resource consumption and enabling new stakeholders to participate in economic systems that before would have been disenfranchised. And these are just supposed to really help or inspire thinking about new ways of creating your business model. And yeah, this is what I've been working on.
Thank you very much. And then we will go directly to Lucas first, and then we'll start post the question and everything, and then we go or deep into a little bit more into your project as well as for Lucas' project and Xinchi.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Maria, and thanks for having me here. Also, I think it's really important work that you're doing at Women in AI and Robotics, so thanks for your work as well. Thanks, Wiebke, also for the overview of what digitalization and sustainability, how they can be correlated. So we are actually mainly focused on sustainability through digitalization with our projects, while we also try to make our systems themselves as sustainable as possible. Yes, I just brought like 3 showcase projects that we are working on basically at Unetic, to show what we can actually maybe do a little bit with AI to help sustainability. So as you know, artificial intelligence in that regard is a base technology, so it can be used in many different fields to help make stuff more sustainable. And that in that way, it mostly is about like 3 things, or like 2 things, which is forecasting energy, forecasting demand, forecasting whatever, and then the other part is optimization. So once we have a forecast of something, let's say if we have a forecast of the demand of products, then we can optimize our production of those products, don't have overproduction. We can maybe also optimize the routing from the product to the end consumer. So it's always around this combination of forecasting and optimization. And the way we use this is, for example, in energy grids. So problem with energy grids nowadays is we want to use more renewable energy, obviously. But then at peak times we'll have more energy maybe that we need, and at other times we don't have enough energy. So the challenge is to kind of synchronize this and use and make the energy grid itself more flexible. And one way we are trying to achieve this is that we use buildings as, let's say, intelligent batteries and energy grids. So what we are doing is we're forecasting the energy grids combination of energy sources and then calculate a CO2 emission factor for the energy grid for a given day. And then we try to shift tasks within a building in an optimized fashion. So when do I heat water? When do I cool rooms? When do I do electric vehicle charging? All these things are kind of flexible tasks within a building that we can shift in their execution time. So we try to do all these tasks in times when there are a lot of renewables in the energy grid. Here we use AI, as said, on the one side to forecast the energy grid, to forecast also the building's usage. When will people be in that building? Because obviously when people are there, we don't want to have it like super cold or super hot. And yeah, then we use the optimization part to kind of synchronize these 2 things. Another area where we're using the kind of the same technologies in forecasting and optimizing are landfills. Most people maybe won't know, but landfills are actually a huge problem when it comes to emissions, because they produce a lot of methane. And methane is about 30 times worse for the climate on a short term than carbon emissions. So we want to avoid producing a lot of methane. And the way we can do this is to not landfill basically our waste and use other technologies to process the waste and contain the methane and the carbon that is stored in there. So what we do here is we were working with a manufacturer of waste processing equipment, and they have a lot of different technologies that they can apply to that waste. So what we're doing is we're forecasting the waste streams that will come in, and then we forecast all the emissions that are related to the different processing steps. So for example, if I have plastic waste, I can recycle it, but I can also burn it and create new energy with it, and then save energy that has to be produced otherwise. So there we are trying to optimize in the waste composition that goes into every processing step so that we have the most CO2 emission savings on that particular type of waste. And then last but not least is a very classical problem and a very classical way to save energy and material, let's say, is there where we're working for a producer of hard metals. And metal production, as you know, is very energy intense. So the less you need to produce, the less metal you use, the more energy you save, basically. And there we took the entire engineering process of one of their products and optimized it. So we don't do any forecasting here, just the optimization part, basically. But what we do is we minimize the material usage for the product because there are a lot of different variants on how you can build the product, and we are trying to find it in an optimized fashion so that the least amount of material is used and therefore the most energy savings are achieved. That as a quick overview of how you could exemplary use AI to save emissions. There are a billion other opportunities. We also released a white paper in the German AI Association about this. So if you're interested in more approaches, feel free to read that. And that, back to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Lucas. So Wiebke and Lucas just mentioned how we can reduce a little bit how we can reduce the carbon footprint with using digitalization and AI. Thank you very much for this. But of course, AI is also producing a lot of carbon emission just by cooling the systems. So I hand over to Xinchi, showing us how we can even reduce these kind of effects and how we can reduce the carbon emission with the huge usage of AI. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks for the introduction, Maria, and thanks for having me in the event today. Here, I will briefly talk about my carbon project, which systematically calculates and quantifying the carbon emission of a particular AI model, either in centralized way, or we have a new framework called federated learning, and we have the systematic quantifying method for quantifying the carbon emission of the federated running an AI experiment in federated learning way. As the AI models are more and more involved in our daily life, it starts to consume more and more energy as a result. For example, Google has these AlphaGo models, which if you look specifically, it consumes, it needs 1,920 CPUs and 280 GPUs for one game, and it costs $3,000 US dollars of electricians for one game. So it is very important for us to fully understand each model and method before we are using it, and to know to fully understand it, we will need to understand how much it consumes the energy and how much carbon emissions it actually has. So in my research, we provide a way to quantify the carbon emissions of both centralized running the AI model in the data center, which we call the centralized way, and running the AI model in a new framework, which we has here is the federated learning way. So to quantify a carbon emission, we will firstly need to estimate the total energy consumption for training a model, either by using a GPU in the data center or using a CPU on the edge devices. For a data center specifically, as you can see here, we will also need to consider the cooling energy as well as all the other actual energy to maintain in the data center. However, for the federated learning way, because we run in the model on edge, so there's no cooling energy required. And for the federated learning, if you are familiar with how the federated learning works, so during the training, we have the central server, and the central server will broadcast all the model parameter for the selected clients and the devices, and the client devices run the AI model using their own data set on the devices using their own CPUs, and then after the training, they will send the model, the update in the model parameter back to the central server. Therefore, in this way, the data transfer and the storage on the devices is a very crucial part that we cannot omit. So we have also need to consider the actual energies for doing this data transfer for the further learning specifications. And the second step is how to convert it the energy consumptions from the energy to the carbon emissions. It would be rather difficult if we want the carbon conversions in a specific location. So in our experiment, we will do this by the countries, and then we will gather this information, as you can see from the table 2 here, like we will gather the carbon electricity to the carbon conversion rates from the government source. And then last but not least, we will run our experiment of the further learning using the framework called Flower, like we are working on at the moment. So Maria, if you can go to the next slide. So to better show our result, I will just show a brief the case study of running a speech command dataset, which is a dataset for the keyword spotting, which we think will be the kind of the data set and the task we will deploy on the edge, and we're more likely to use the further learning framework in the to use further learning. So comparing the centralized learning and the further learning, because we are using CPU rather than a very powerful GPU, so intuitively we would use more, it will require a longer time for the training, and we might think like it requires it would consume more energy. However, because of the power consumption of the edge devices, which is at the very only a fraction of the power consumption from the GPU, even though it takes longer, there's a huge potential here, and it doesn't necessarily cost more energy or emit more carbon as a result. So there are a few takeaways, like I will briefly show here. The first is the communications cost. Because the model parameters are communicating during each round, and the communication cost actually takes up a rather large percentage of the total energy cost. As you can see here, the communication cost takes 37% if we do this 5 local epoch training, and takes up as high as 75% if we do 1 local epoch training. And the second is like if we have the dataset distribution amount the edge devices is more IID, which is more uniform, the training will be easier, so it takes less time to train, so it will obviously emit less carbon. And the third is the more advanced aggregation strategies we have for the further learning. For example, we show here the Fed Adam will make further learning more carbon efficient compared to the centralized learning if we see in the last 2 columns. So it can actually emit less carbon if we compare to the centralized learning. So this case study showed us like the further learning on the device, training on the devices has these potentials that can bring the AI models, even though we are using the same model, more carbon efficient and more green. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you. Good. Thank you for the introduction of all of you experts. It was really interesting. So, Wiebke, my first question would be to you. Can you identify special like components or things that are really carbon emission consuming or are consuming a lot of carbon, and what are the biggest players in projects, or and how can we solve them? How can we reduce actively the carbon footprint of companies or of projects?
See, I forgot to unmute myself too. Well, to be honest, my my background is not so much in the assessment of carbon footprints, but what I've seen in my research, or one major problem in the sustainability literature in general, is that the assessment is so complicated, and that is actually something that that research is shying away from, I would say, to actually pinpoint how we should assess sustainability, and that just makes it, that is the part that is making the decision making so hard. So that is something I would say needs to be addressed more thoroughly in the future, actually. that we make the assessment more accessible, and that it is more transparent. Because, you know, I think as consumers, we are experiencing this as well, that we often don't know, you know, is this actually sustainable or is it just greenwashed? And that translates to other levels as well. Yeah, that's what I would say is where actually more research is needed, and not just with regards to the carbon footprint, because, you know, carbon footprint is just so, I don't know, it's convenient to use that, but there's so much that is, you know, left out when we're just looking at the carbon footprint. So we need transparent and multifaceted and encompassing assessment, actually.
Thank you. And what else? I mean, despite from the carbon footprint, what else? I mean, you said there are many factors. What you can measure. What else you can exactly measure that you are sustainable or that you have something sustainable?
I always think that we should actually incorporate more social factors, that we need to make, you know, human rights violations auditable, that we need more transparency in the supply chain. Those things need to be factored in, and that's kind of the part that is, you know, that forced perspective of offsetting, which is making it so hard, that is making it so hard to determine if and when we have actually reached that, because you know, factoring environmental aspects against social aspects, you know, is something that I believe none of us would like to do. But for example, the use of cobalt in our technologies, you know, that certainly is linked to human suffering. But if these technologies, you know, have positive environmental effects, or they have positive social effects in other parts of the world, then who would want to, you know, measure these up against each other? That is just something that's, you know, making it very complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, and do you have any idea how, for example, for myself, if I, so you just mentioned what can be measured, let's say, what we have to take into account, but how can I see this? I mean, do you think that we would need more, like, if I buy like a product, do we need kind of list on where does it come from, which who produced it, and I mean, how can it be done? Or for everyone, it should be very easy to find these things out that you just mentioned. What is your idea how we can find it out?
I'm not quite sure if I'm reading it correctly, so let me know if you know. I do.
Yeah, sorry, it was really unclear my question. No, if I just like, if I order something, do you think there should be like a list with all these things listed? What kind of influence it has, how sustainable it can be, or do you have like, should it have like some project or product having like an sustainable score, or do you have any ideas how we can show other people that something is sustainable?
I think scores are really helpful. So I am a proponent of them. However, I think we need to move away from individual responsibility. So these scores are great if, as a consumer, you want to make, you know, the sustainable choice. But what we need more of is actually policy that ensures that, you know, companies need to be knowledgeable about their own supply chain, that they need to create transparency about their supply chain and, you know, the violations that may happen in there, or the environmental impacts that they're having, so that actually it's not on the consumers anymore to ensure the social and environmental sustainability of a product. But from a consumer perspective, yes, scores are great, and actually making all the information about the supply chain accessible for the consumer is great as well. I mean, there are companies that, you know, will provide their products with a QR code, which you can scan and then see, you know, every step of the supply chain, where every part of the product has come from, and providing that type of transparency and actually making it a standard practice is something that I think would benefit all of us.
Yes, great, thank you. Lucas, to you, do you already work on sustainable projects? Do you have some problems that you often face when you want to realize a sustainable problem in different kinds? Is there do you face them?
Yeah, I maybe want to add to what Wiebke was saying. The problem is always, right, the supply chain. So when we talk about emissions, mainly for companies, then we talk about scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 is basically what is your company emitting itself. If somebody drives by car, there are CO2 emissions. Scope 2 is the energy that you use. It's also quite easy to measure because you have like an energy counter. So that is also easy. But then scope 3 is the real problem, because there are no real standards and there's no real data to measure the emissions in your supply chain, and then your suppliers will mostly won't tell you as well what their emissions are affected then to your single product. So what we really need here is a German say durchgängig, like from start to end of the product. With every single piece that is in the product, we would need to track what emissions are affected to that. And that is really hard to do, especially because, yeah, there's a lot of data and standards missing. It's a little bit scattered from the landscape, and there are some standards that you can apply to, but there's definitely no global standard. And there are also then a lot of different databases out there that have emission factors then for every single thing in different countries, but it's the problem is quite challenging, I would say, to really measure these emissions. I hope this will get better. There's quite a lot of new regulation coming in the EU. I hope they will also introduce these standards and then also maybe data sets with that people can work, because for now everyone who isn't like carbon accounting is basically building up their own database on how to do this. So this is quite challenging, and that is also what is the problem in our sustainability projects that we do, is to measure the baseline on what do we actually achieve in savings, right? Because it's hard to assess what is the status quo already now, and then how much emissions do we really save. So this is already quite vague, and then you can say, okay, we're improving a process by 30%, but what does this really mean for the emissions is quite hard. So I think, yeah, there's still a lot of greenwashing going on as well, because maybe not even on purpose, but it's very hard to tell how much emissions you are actually saving.
Okay, and so I'm also an AI engineer, and I wonder how you exactly measure them. What kind of data are you taking that you can transfer them into CO2 emission or whatever? How is this possible? Yeah,
this is basically, this is really the challenge. I mean, you take, I mean, it always in the end is about energy, right? So most of the stuff is, okay, how much energy do we use? But then energy this is really hard to then, because the level of detail can be vague. You can say, okay, in this country, energy has this CO2 emissions to it, which is than an average value, but then you can make it very detailed as well. And you can say, okay, at this point in time, this much energy was consumed. And at that point in time, the energy grid in that specific location was 20% solar, 20% wind, and 60% coal. So the question is really, how detailed do you want to get there? And I think for now, it's already enough if we're not going on that detail level, even if it would be more interesting. But this is basically how you start. And then, and what we're not in carbon accounting, right? So we are mostly making processes more efficient. But what I know from carbon accounting companies is that they mainly start with finance accounting, so that every transaction they do in their bank account, basically, that has attached a CO2 value to it. And then for everything that you have in there is, I mean, you need like a CO2 emission factor. And then you say, okay, I went to the gas station, 50 liters of diesel, this emission factor. I used that amount of energy, this emission factor. And that makes it a little bit easier to break it down.
And do you see a trend in this field in the case of sustainability? You already mentioned that greenwashing. Do you see, I mean, a positive trend, not only greenwashing, but do you see also a positive trend?
I see the trend that the interest is rising, at least. So more companies are obviously interested in that. What still I think is missing, just from a mindset, is that it's not only about doing stuff for the climate. I mean, many people still think if I reduce my emissions, it costs more. For some reason, this is still the general thinking of most people. But in fact, that is basically a lie, because if I reduce my emissions, I mostly reduce my energy usage, which means I also save money. But of course, you have an invest in the beginning that you need to take to implement these systems that will then in later phases save you money. So there's still, even if it is slowly rising to people, and that this can also be beneficial for the businesses, which it mostly is, it still takes a while for everyone to get that.
Yeah, imagine. And where do you think, I mean, where do we need more improvements in this case?
Yeah,
I mean, is it more the political side that we need more improvements, making things easier, or I mean, the data you already mentioned, having like the data everywhere the same. Is there something else we need more improvements?
Yeah, there are many sides that we need to tackle, right? Of course, from the political side, you always have a lot of leverage to also make these sustainable AI cases, or general improving on sustainability more, to make business cases more viable. And that leverage is pretty easy. It's called a CO2 tax that's already in place. But if the more CO2 emissions cost, the more viable these business cases get, and the more companies are interested in this. Because if a ton of CO2 costs 200 euros to emit, then everybody's like, okay, how can I save these 200 euros? So from a political standpoint, this is one thing they can do. And then on the other hand, obviously this is bad for the consumer as well, because then everything gets more expensive, so that we also don't want. But another side on this is data. Data, as you probably know, Maria, is always a problem. There's not enough, and then the quality is bad. So yeah, from one side, obviously, to put standards out there for carbon accounting, obviously, but then also for companies to exchange data, for example, and give them maybe help to generate data in the first place. And companies, obviously, that's the same problem there. They need to think about where can I actually generate data for sustainability, and then how can I use that? So obviously there needs to happen much more from their side as well. And they really should start now, because what will happen is that the CO2 prices will rise. This is a fact. This will happen. So the earlier you start collecting that data that you can then later use to reduce your CO2 emissions, the better it is, because the faster you can actually save on emissions, and then emissions will be money in latest 5 years. It will be a lot.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, thank you, Lucas. So Xinchi, let's ask you some questions, and also to the chat. Please ask your question. I will directly then go through the questions, and that you can also answer your questions in the chat. So Xinchi, you already calculated the CO2 emission or carbon footprint of AI systems. Do you think that a federated learning is the only way to go, or is a good way to go? Can we always use federated learning to reduce the carbon footprint?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So I think from our initial result, no, federated learning is not always the good options to go to. For example, I only showed the speech command data set here, but we also do some other data set. So for example, if we do the CIFAR-10 data set for the Resonate 18 model, so I think for the federated learning to be so there's a few factors can impact the total carbon emissions. For the first is the exact model we use. So if we for example, if we use a very large model on a rather simple data set, so for speech command data set here, we use the simple LSTM model. But if we use a very big data set with a lot of model parameters, so think about that. Every time we communicate the model parameters, we will consume more energy through the communication, and hence emit more carbon. So to correctly choosing the right model is very important to the right model for the data set. So if we, for example, if we do the CIFAR-10 data set, it's not very difficult, but if we use a quite a expensive model like the Resonate 18, the communication cost can actually take up to over 90% of the total energy cost, which doesn't sound right because the model is too big. And the second reason, I think the federated learning currently is like second factors can impact the total energy consumption and the carbon emission is the data distribution, because we are using the data set on the device without transferring the data set to a central locations. So the data distribution can be very different from one device to the other, which makes the training more difficult than the traditional data center training way. So we are still looking for more advanced and more adaptive method to make the training on the federated learning more efficient and have the better performance compared to what we have right now. What we have right now is like we only have like the federated averaging methods or the federated add-on. But if we look at the performance of like the CIFAR-10 on the speech command cannot be as high as the performance of the if we're training using the data center because of this data distribution. If we simulate the data distribution, which as a very non-RID across different devices, the performance will be even lower. So there's still a lot of research like going on and needs more research to make the performance better and a more efficient way. And the third is the third is the aggregation method, as I described before. If we use the less obviously more advanced method can be developed to make the total training rounds, or we say like the training rounds or training times less compared to what we have right now. For example, what we have right now here is like we need more than 500 rounds or even 1,000 rounds or even longer if we do like the larger data set like ImageNet. So this is still have a very large potential and the gap between the centralized way and the federated learning way. So if we can reduce this gap, we can largely reduce the communication costs, because each round when you communicate between the central server and the client and the devices, the communication cost is constant because the model of the parameter is constant. And if we can reduce the number of the rounds, we can also reduce the local training time and the training consumption on the device as well.
Thank you. Very interesting. And I mean, do you think that the trend will go further into the cloud computing? Or I mean, it is quite energy consuming. Do you think that we will still go ahead with this cloud computing?
I think there's like the cloud computing or like the further learning way, both has pros and cons. And the main advantage of the further learning is like, first, as we mentioned, there's a huge potential for it to be more sustainability. And the second one is like the privacy concern. So you don't need to transfer your data to the data center or to the cloud. And then or sometimes because of all the regulations, you can now transfer your data abroad. But if you do it in this way, in the further learning way or decentralized way, you can actually use all the data center around the world without transferring data. And then so there's like the extra bonus like the actual bonus on top of the sustainability potentials here.
Mm-hmm. And a last question from my side. So you presented us that from different countries, you have like a different numbers for the carbon emission. Why do we have such large difference between the countries?
The large is I think someone mentioned in the chat, like some countries, for example, like France use a lot of nuclear energies, which emit less carbon compared to, for example, more developing country like China using a lot of coal. So this large difference is mainly coming from the energy source. If you're using more carbon intensive energy source, you will obviously emit more carbon compared to if you are using more cleaner energy source in some locations. So that brings us to another like advantage of using this decentralized learning way. So if we can choose freely the locations we do the training, we can choose the locations like has more cleaner energy source to do the training. So make the total training more green.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So let's go to the question from the chat. So we have a few questions here.
Maria, can I add
yes,
one thing Xinchi
of
said?
course.
Because we just had the discussion, right, that where the data center is located will affect its energy consumption, which is true, obviously. But if we would say, okay, then we always just do calculations in a country that is 100% renewable, are we then fine? It's kind of always the question, because then we don't have any direct emission or any data center emissions, for example, anymore, because we're using clean energy. But this is always only just half of the truth, because thinking about it, then you also go into scope 3 and think, okay, where do the components of the data center actually come from? And then they also need to be produced. And in a general data center, a server needs to get exchanged on average all 2 years, which is obviously also not good. So in general, we should reduce server usage, for example. And then I don't know, Xinchi, if you're also looking into this, probably not, because it's actually quite complex. When we do federated learning, then we're doing it on much smaller devices, right? So we're using components or devices that are already there, like phones that are produced, let's say, anyway. Obviously, they should also not go bad faster, but this also maybe saves then on the production, because we're using devices that are used for multiple purposes.
That is true. That is true. So like we are using the mobile phones, like it's already produced anyway. And then we ideally we would like to have the training, for example, when they are charging, so it will consume less energy, or when they are not doing any other stuff. So we would so ideally we would like to have the training happen and the devices like can consume less energy compared to like from the data center, which is always constant, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, thank you for this comment, Lucas, and also Xinchi. I have a question here from the chat, which is quite interesting. I think we maybe can answer this. So I just will read. Social justice and sustainability are highly correlated. However, bringing them under the same umbrella makes the umbrella too large to address with individual interventions? Should they not be addressed as distinct problems?
I did read that earlier when it was posted, and I'm going to have to say, with regards to addressing it, yes, they should be kept separate. I don't think it makes sense to actually weigh them against each other. But that doesn't mean that, you know, we shouldn't track them both. And I think actually that social justice issues are being overlooked in the regard that, you know, the carbon footprint is such a prominent tool to discuss sustainability. And so I would say that yeah, just that we need to widen our look on these issues actually, and, you know, keep an eye on all metrics and not focus not focus solely on the carbon footprint, because in public debate it tends to get reduced to carbon footprint. So yeah, that would be my take.
Yes, thank you very much also for pointing this out, because you're completely right. I think you always have to see different point out that, or see what other effects play a role, and it's quite important. Thank you also reminding me this, to remind me this. Another question, I think maybe to Lucas more, is what metrics should companies be tracking when developing AI solutions?
It depends on the use case, right? Or what kind of, I don't know if I can aspect, but like, is the question regarded into like when a company like mine is developing AI solutions? And I mean, like what we are tracking, maybe I can give like a few insights, and that is we are always tracking our CO2 emissions of the models and how, what models we took. So specifically in AI development, there are a few things you can do, and always obviously starts from the algorithm choosement. So if you're choosing an algorithm that is too big, it might solve your problem, but it will use more calculation and compute time. So that you should track, right? What was your problem? What was the data set? What algorithm did you choose, and how long did it need to train? And then, yeah, then we're just calculating basically the CO2 emissions that are attached to our algorithm training and in general to our compute time. And then from the other side, you should maybe track how much you can possibly save using these algorithms, but that is not trackable. That is just always like a suggestion in the future.
Yeah, I think it was a very good answer. For me, it helped quite a lot. I have never thought about taking care of the algorithm, but you're completely right. So I think most of the questions are answered. Yes, and I think maybe if someone else wants to pose a question or ask a question, just tell me now, or just write it now, or just unmute yourself and you can ask the question. So just to remind you, so next week there will be another Women in AI and Robotics event with Authority Gap. You can also sign up for it. Just check our LinkedIn page. So please sign up. It will be very, very interesting. I will also be around. So another last question I would like to pose is, wait, there was another question. So I think, so can you decide, I mean, the question here is the view of the data center something you take into consideration when deciding on the provider? So is there something you check to if the data center is a good data center? And my question would be, can you even check, or maybe Lucas, can you check even if you would take this or that computer center? Is there a possibility to go for a certain computing center?
Definitely. I mean, obviously, what you can check is what energy they are using, but then data centers are quite frankly differently, right? So we're, for example, working with cloud and heat. So a normal data center is like a big fridge. There are a lot of servers that produce heat, and then they are in a fridge that cools them. But for example, cloud and heat does what also a few other providers will do. They do liquid cooling of the servers, and then they take the heated water in warming buildings, for example, which is much more effective than just taking the heat out by using a big fridge. Maybe Xinchi also answered the question in the chat, wants to add on that.
For us, the PUE ratio we calculate for the centralized learning scenario is we get a source for the average PUE ratio globally, and then we also consider the major data center providers, for example, like the Amazon or the Google, and then they will provide their PUE ratio on an annually basis. So I'm using their data on their website, basically.
Great, thank you. Really nice. If there's no open question anymore, then I thank you very much to the expert for this very interesting talk and discussion. I learned a lot today, and I hope we see you soon. And I hope that you continue with your work in the sustainability and green AI part. And I think it's quite important also for the future going or thinking about more sustainability in our projects, and also thinking about the energy consumptions of projects, of AI setups and everything, having the right algorithm, using different technologies, new technology, and also having a lot of research in this part. So thank you again for for being here, having the time today, joining it, asking or answering the questions. And also thank you to all the people, participants here in the chat and in the meeting. And I hope to see you next week in the Authority Gap from Women in AI and Robotics. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.